Daniel lay in the sterile white bed, the dull beeping of the monitor echoing in the room. His body ached from the fall down the stairs, his leg heavy with plaster, but what hurt more was the sight before him. His family had gathered, not around him, not for him, but with their eyes turned toward Matthew, the younger brother who had returned only months ago yet somehow stolen everything. Their voices were soft with sympathy, their smiles strained in his direction, but their words, every one of them, belonged to Matthew. Nancy stood near the foot of the bed, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Don't be harsh on him," she told Daniel's parents in a voice that carried enough weight to silence the room. Matthew panicked. He didn't mean to hurt Daniel. He needs our support right now. Her words cut deep. He was the one broken and bruised, yet his wife rushed to defend another man. Daniel's gaze fixed on her, searching for even a flicker of concern, but she would not meet his eyes. His mother stepped closer, her hand brushing Matthew's arm with maternal affection Daniel hadn't felt in months. "He's been through so much already. After suffering outside all those years, how can we blame him for a mistake?" His father nodded, adding coldly, "Daniel should let this go. Matthew deserves a chance." From the corner of the room came the sharpest blow. His daughter, still so young but already firm in her judgment, looked at him with eyes full of disdain. "Dad, why do you always fight with Uncle Matthew? If only he had been my father instead." Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear, each syllable hammering into his chest harder than the pain in his leg. He remembered when that little girl once clung to him after nightmares, begging for comfort, when she used to laugh brightest in his arms. Now, she looked at him as though he were the villain. He forced a weak smile, but it slipped away quickly. Matthew crouched near the bed, wearing a mask of remorse, his eyes carefully lowered. "Bro, I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen," he said, but Daniel saw the glimmer of calculation in his gaze, the satisfaction that no one else seemed to notice. Everyone saw only his apology, his regret, while Daniel remained the cold, ungrateful son, the harsh husband, the unfit father. Flat on his back, Daniel realized with chilling clarity that even at his weakest, even when he could barely move, he had already been pushed to the margins. His family had chosen their new star. He was no longer the center, no longer needed. In their story, he was the expendable one, a shadow cast aside for Matthew's light. Daniel had never been handed anything. From the very beginning, every small achievement in his life came from effort, persistence, and an iron will that refused to bend. When his father, a man proud of his business acumen, insisted that Daniel start from the bottom of the family company, Daniel didn't object. He wore the cheapest suits, worked the longest hours, and performed tasks his colleagues considered beneath him. He fetched files, sorted through endless rows of paperwork, ran errands that left him exhausted, and learned by watching others rather than by being taught. He remembered staying late in the office when everyone else had gone home, poring over ledgers and contracts until his eyes blurred, teaching himself what no one had the patience to show him. 8 years it took, 8 years of climbing rung by rung, until he earned the vice president position on merit alone. No shortcuts, no favoritism, just the quiet accumulation of trust and skill. He had been the one who steadied the company when storms threatened to sink it, the one who carried burdens his father claimed were a test of character. He was proud, not because he had inherited authority, but because he had earned it. In those early days, when exhaustion nearly broke him, Nancy had been at his side. They met in college, both members of the same student club. She was not the dazzling beauty others sought after, but her quiet ambition and warmth drew him in. She worked part-time jobs to pay tuition, insisting she didn't want to rely on anyone. When they started dating, she refused gifts, refused money, and split expenses with a determination that made him admire her more. He remembered late nights studying together, her head resting on his shoulder as she whispered that one day she would be good enough to match him. He told her she already was. He remembered the day she cut ties with a close friend Waze. O mocked her for not using Daniel's money, proof, it seemed then, of her loyalty. Their love was not glamorous, but it was real. At least, Daniel thought it was. When they married, his family accepted her without resistance, and for years he believed he had chosen wisely. Nancy cried when their daughter was born, holding the tiny infant as if she held the world. Daniel promised to protect them both no matter the cost. But promises, he would learn, could crumble under the weight of betrayal. Karen had known Daniel even before Nancy did. She had been part of the same circle in college, always present at group projects and club meetings. Unlike Nancy, she never confessed feelings outright. Her loyalty was quieter, almost invisible at the time. She supported Daniel's ideas, defended him when others doubted, and listened when he spoke of his ambitions. When he and Nancy began dating, Karen withdrew, burying her admiration behind a polite smile. Over the years, she carved her own path, staying close enough to cross paths with him at company events or family gatherings. She had never been a central figure in his life, but her silent support lingered in his memory, like a candle burning in the background, steady, unacknowledged, but always there. For a long time, Daniel believed his sacrifices would bind his family closer together. He gave everything: time, energy, even his health. He once worked 3 nights in a row without sleep to secure a deal that saved the company from collapse. Another time, he risked his life rushing to his daughter when she nearly fell from a staircase, his body breaking the fall. That accident left him unconscious for 3 days, and when he woke, it was Nancy's tearful face that greeted him, whispering that she couldn't live without him. Those moments, painful yet tender, convinced him that all his struggles were worth it. Then Matthew returned. Daniel still remembered the day as if it were etched into his bones. The younger brother, who had been lost, raised elsewhere after being kidnapped as a child, was suddenly found and brought home. The family rejoiced. His parents cried, his sister embraced him, and even Nancy wore a glow of excitement. Daniel himself welcomed Matthew, believing there might finally be another man in the house to share responsibility, another sibling to lean on. But joy soon turned into displacement. Within weeks, the same father who had forced Daniel to grind for years placed Matthew directly into his position, entrusting him with the very project Daniel had been preparing to complete. "He needs a chance to prove himself," his father had said. "As his older brother, you should guide him." Daniel's protests fell on deaf ears. At first, he thought Nancy would stand by him, the way she always had, but she surprised him. "Matthew has suffered enough," she told Daniel, her tone edged with reproach. "Isn't it time you showed compassion? As his brother, you should take care of him." It stung more than any wound, her siding with Matthew, her forgetting the nights Daniel had worked himself to the bone for their family, their child, for her. His mother's kindness, once his anchor, was redirected entirely toward Matthew. She excused his mistakes, defended his rash decisions, and smiled warmly at him in ways she no longer did at Daniel. His father's praise shifted, too, toward this new son, who had endured hardship. Daniel's sister, who once admired his perseverance, now scolded him for selfishness whenever he raised concerns. Slowly, steadily, every role Daniel had filled was given to Matthew, every ounce of affection diverted to him. And Nancy followed suit. At first, she defended Matthew under the guise of being an older sister-in-law, telling Daniel that she was only helping him adjust, but Daniel saw the way her voice softened when she spoke Matthew's name, the way she smiled when Matthew entered the room, the way she forgot Daniel even when he was sitting beside her. She stopped calling him my brother-in-law, and began simply saying Matthew. The final crack came from his daughter. Once she had adored him, clinging to his hand and laughing at his smallest gestures. Now, she turned to Matthew with bright eyes, accepting small gifts and stories as if he were her hero. When she whispered that she wished Matthew had been her father, Daniel's world shattered. Karen saw the changes from afar. She never intruded, never offered more than a quiet word of encouragement, but Daniel noticed her eyes, how they carried sympathy when no one else cared to see his pain. He did not reach for her then, bound by marriage and loyalty, but her presence reminded him that he was not entirely invisible. The more Matthew thrived under undeserved praise, the more Daniel faded into the background. His sacrifices were erased, his achievements forgotten, his worth denied. Where once he had been the pillar of the family, he was now treated as a shadow, an obstacle to Matthew's rise. The home that had once felt warm became a theater where he played the villain, cast aside so that Matthew could be the star. It was in that cruel irony, after years of bleeding for them, protecting them, giving them everything, that Daniel realized what it meant to be unwanted. His sacrifices, the very foundation of their stability, had become invisible, and in their blindness they pushed him further into the margins, believing he would endure it as he always had. But this time, something inside him had begun to change. Daniel had spent months preparing the numbers. He had combed through every line of data, double-checking figures until his head throbbed. This project was supposed to be the capstone of his work, a merger that would not only stabilize the family business but expand it into new markets. He left nothing to chance. Every file was neatly labeled, every detail meticulously highlighted. Before his accident, before the fall, he had even briefed Matthew with a complete handover package. All Matthew had to do was follow instructions. But Matthew never cared for details. He skimmed reports, glanced at figures, and when the decimal point slipped, he didn't notice. It was a small error with enormous consequences, a single miscalculation that rippled outward until the deal collapsed. Investors panicked, partners withdrew, and overnight the company's reputation was shaken. Daniel, still recovering in his hospital bed, received the news like a knife in the chest. He had anticipated difficulties, but not sabotage disguised as incompetence. When the family came to confront him, he expected, naively, that they would see through Matthew's carelessness. Instead, his father's voice thundered through the room. "Daniel, how could you be so irresponsible? You were supposed to guide your brother. Do you expect a man who has just returned, who doesn't even know the ropes, to shoulder this alone?" Daniel's mouth went dry. "Father, I gave him everything he needed, the files, the explanations, it was all there." He ignored them. Freya, his sister, cut in sharply. "You always make excuses. You act like you're the only one who works hard, but you refuse to admit when you've made mistakes. I saw the handover packet. You overwhelmed him with details no one could absorb in one sitting. This is your fault for setting him up to fail." Nancy stood at the corner, arms folded, expression unreadable, but when he finally spoke, her words landed harder than the accusations. "Daniel, maybe you should reflect. Matthew is new. You've had years to learn how to navigate these things. Isn't it cruel to expect him to be perfect immediately? If something went wrong, shouldn't you take responsibility as his elder brother?" Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. The man who had spent 8 years crawling his way up was being told he should bow his head and accept blame for another's negligence. His father didn't stop there. "This family cannot afford division. We need unity, so you will bear the weight for now. Matthew must be protected while he finds his footing. Be patient." Every word erased years of sacrifice. Daniel looked around at their faces, searching for a single glimmer of fairness. His mother avoided his gaze, her hand resting comfortingly on Matthew's arm. Freya glared, daring him to argue. Nancy's eyes were cool, a stranger's eyes. Only Matthew, head lowered in feigned remorse, seemed satisfied, his lips twitching at the corners as though hiding a smile. When Daniel tried to defend himself, his daughter interrupted, her small voice louder than his. "Dad, why do you always blame Uncle Matthew? He's kind to me, he brings me gifts. You're always so strict, always scolding me. If Uncle were my father, things would be better." The words silenced him more effectively than any command. His own child, his little girl, saw him as the enemy, while she looked to Matthew as her hero. He wanted to shout, to demand recognition for the nights he had stayed awake caring for her when she was sick, for the sacrifices he made to ensure she had everything she needed, but the words stuck in his throat. What good would they do? No one in that room wanted to hear them. His daughter's disdain was the echo of Nancy's coldness, of his family's betrayal. Matthew raised his head then, his voice soft and trembling. "Dad, Mom, it's my fault too. Don't blame brother. I should have been more careful." His tone was dripping with humility, but Daniel saw the performance. His father, however, sighed in approval. "This is why I believe in you, Matthew. Even in mistakes, you take responsibility. Daniel should learn from you." Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity. He, the man who had borne every burden without complaint, was now being lectured on responsibility by the very people who had stripped him of his dignity. Freya placed a hand on their mother's shoulder and spoke with finality. "Let's not waste any more time. Daniel, rest and reflect. When you recover, you'll return to the company, not as vice president, but as Matthew's support. That is the best way you can contribute now." The decree left no room for negotiation. His achievements, his position, his sacrifices, all wiped clean in a single sentence. Silence fell heavy in the room. Daniel felt it pressing on his chest, heavier than the plaster on his leg. He realized in that moment that his voice had been erased. No matter what he said, it would be twisted. No matter how much he gave, it would never be enough. In their eyes, he was already the villain, strict, selfish, unwilling to share. Matthew was the wronged younger brother, Nancy the compassionate wife who defended him, and Daniel was the obstacle to their harmony. He turned his face toward the window, unwilling to let them see the storm in his eyes. Beyond the glass, the city glimmered in indifferent light, as if mocking his downfall. For the first time, he felt what it truly meant to be silenced, not by force, but by betrayal, and in that silence, something in him began to shift. Daniel lay back against the stiff hospital pillow, staring at the ceiling where the fluorescent lights hummed faintly. The plaster cast weighed heavy on his leg, but the weight on his chest was worse. He closed his eyes, hoping for rest, yet his mind betrayed him by unspooling memories that refused to fade. He remembered Nancy as she had once been, so different from the woman who now stood by Matthew's side. In college, she had been the one who stayed up with him in the library, both of them too poor to afford tutors. He remembered the stubborn way she refused to let him pay for her textbooks, insisting on covering her own expenses with part-time jobs. Her pride back then had seemed like strength, a sign of her sincerity. Once, when her friends mocked her for not cashing in on his ambition, she had turned on them with sharp words, declaring she loved him for himself, not for his money. He had believed her then, he had believed in her. The memory shifted to the day of their wedding. She had walked toward him in a modest white dress, nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, but her smile had been brighter than any jewel. He remembered thinking he was the luckiest man alive. When their daughter was born, Nancy had cried harder than the baby, clutching the infant as though she were holding the entire universe. "She's ours," she had whispered through her tears. "We'll protect her together." For years, he had carried those promises like armor. Even when he staggered under the pressures of work, even when exhaustion threatened to break him, he reminded himself of Nancy's smile and his daughter's laugh. He told himself it was all worth it. Now those same two people looked at him with disdain. His wife's arms folded across her chest, shielding Matthew. His daughter's words, sharp and cruel, "If only Uncle Matthew had been my father." He felt the memories splinter. The woman who had once fought for his love now fought against him. The child he had nearly died to protect wished he were someone else. He had given them his strength, his loyalty, his sleepless nights, and they gave him contempt in return. He turned his face to the wall, listening to the muted sounds of the hospital. Somewhere down the corridor, a nurse laughed. Somewhere, someone's heart monitor beeped steadily. His own heart felt heavy, but not with grief. Something colder, harder, was beginning to form. At first, the pain tore at him. He asked himself questions that had no answers. When did Nancy stop loving me? Was it gradual, or had it always been a mask? When did my daughter stop being mine? He remembered carrying her through feverish nights, rocking her in his arms until dawn. He remembered sacrificing meals, sleep, even his health so she could smile, and still, she preferred Matthew. The cruel irony burned. His father had demanded he start from the bottom of the company, claiming it was for his growth. He had accepted without complaint, fought his way up, and saved the business countless times. Now that same father handed everything to Matthew on a silver platter. His sister once praised him for his persistence, but now she sneered that he was selfish. His mother, who used to dote on him, looked at him only with disappointment. Piece by piece, they had stripped him down until nothing remained. He was not the beloved son, not the respected husband, not the admired father. He was a scapegoat, a shadow, a supporting character written only to make Matthew shine. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. He saw it clearly now. This was not his story. It had never been. Everything he had endured, every sacrifice he had made, had been paving the way for Matthew to rise. He had been cast as the villain, the foil, the disposable brother who would fall so the other could succeed. For a moment, despair clawed at him. His throat tightened, his eyes burned, and he wanted to scream, to rage, to demand why. But then, slowly, the storm passed. In its place came something unexpected: stillness. If he was only a side character, then why fight for a role he was never meant to keep? Why beg for scraps of affection from people who had already replaced him? Why carry loyalty like a chain when it had only made him a slave to their whims? A cold detachment spread through him. He realized he no longer cared for their approval. Their judgments no longer had power. They could call him selfish, cruel, unworthy. It didn't matter. What mattered was freedom. He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling, and in that sterile light, he made decisions that felt final. He would resign from the company. Let Matthew have it. Let his father and sister shower him with praise. He would no longer waste his energy fighting for what was never truly his. He would divorce Nancy. She had already chosen her side, already shown where her loyalty lay. She was Matthew's defender now, not his partner. She could have the role she seemed to want so badly, the dutiful sister-in-law, perhaps even more. As for their daughter, the thought stabbed him, but even that pain dulled under his new clarity. If she wanted Matthew as her father, then so be it, he would not fight her choice. His plan was simple, and for the first time in months, his chest felt lighter. He would hand over the company gracefully, sign the divorce papers without argument, and walk away. He had investments of his own, savings they knew nothing about. He did not need their money, he did not need their name. He needed only peace. As he lay in silence, the voices of his family echoed faintly in his mind, his father's lectures, his sister's accusations, his mother's excuses, Nancy's cold defense of Matthew, his daughter's cruel wish. Once, those voices had broken him, now they barely stirred a flicker. He realized with startling clarity that their betrayal was a gift. It freed him from illusions, from burdens, from a love that had already rotted. They had written him out of their story. Good, he would write his own. The beeping monitor carried on steadily, each beat echoing the calm within him. Daniel closed his eyes again, not in despair this time, but in resolve. When he left this hospital, he would not return to the life he once knew, he would end it all on his own terms. And when they looked at him again, expecting the same obedient son, the same selfless brother, the same forgiving husband, they would see only silence. Silence sharper than words, colder than rage, silence that marked the death of the Daniel they once knew. The awakening had begun. Daniel had expected the whispers, the veiled accusations, the cold stares that trailed him whenever he entered a room. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the entire family would pivot from disappointment to condemnation. One evening, not long after his discharge from the hospital, he returned home to find Nancy pale-faced, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. Matthew tried to kill himself, she said without preamble, her voice cracking. Are you satisfied now? You've pushed him too far. The word stunned him. What? She thrust the phone toward him. A picture filled the screen, Matthew unconscious in a hospital bed, tubes attached to his arm, his face deathly pale. The caption, posted by Freya, read, "He couldn't bear the pain anymore. Pray for him." Daniel's first reaction was disbelief. He had seen Matthew only the day before, smug and calculating as always, whispering that he was handling things. A suicide attempt? It smelled of performance, and yet, the family swallowed it whole. When Daniel rushed to the hospital, the scene confirmed his worst fears. His parents, Freya, and even Nancy surrounded Matthew's bed, their faces streaked with tears. His daughter clung to Matthew's limp hand, sobbing. His mother turned on Daniel the moment he entered, her voice sharp as a blade. What did you say to him? What cruelty did you unleash that drove him to this? Daniel froze. Nothing. I said nothing to... His father cut him off, his voice cold, final. Enough. We've endured your selfishness for too long. You've belittled him, accused him, pushed him aside, and now this. We will not allow you to continue destroying this family. Nancy's gaze was colder than ice. You can't even admit what you've done. Look at him, Daniel. Look at what you reduced him to. He came into this family with hope, and you crushed it. Do you have no heart at all? Daniel stared at her, searching for the woman who once vowed she couldn't live without him. All he found was contempt. Then his daughter's small voice pierced through everything. I don't want you to be my father anymore. You're cruel. Uncle Matthew loves me more than you ever did. The hospital room spun around him. His own blood, his own child, looking at him as though he were a monster. Matthew stirred then, his eyes fluttering open with perfect timing. He whispered hoarsely, Brother, I'm sorry, I never wanted this, I only wanted us to get along. His voice cracked, his expression trembling with guilt. But when their eyes met, Daniel saw it, the flicker of triumph buried in those carefully staged tears. His mother broke down again. Do you see? Even now, even after all this, he worries for you. And you? You stand there like stone. What happened to you, Daniel? Where is the son I raised? His father's decree came swiftly. From today, you are no longer part of this family. I've already spoken with legal. The company's shares, the assets, the inheritance, they will pass to Freya and Matthew. You've chosen to abandon us, so we will abandon you. Daniel said nothing. The weight of years of effort, loyalty, and sacrifice crashed down on him, only to vanish like smoke. All those nights spent carrying the company, all the love he thought he had earned, gone. He watched his father's face, etched with lines of disappointment, and felt nothing. His mother's sobs no longer pierced him. His daughter's rejection no longer broke him. His wife's contempt no longer cut him open. They had made their choice. Later, as the others left the room to let Matthew rest, Daniel lingered. He wanted one more look at this man who had stolen everything. Matthew, eyes closed, lips curled faintly, spoke without opening them. "You see how easy it was?" His voice was low, mocking. "One bottle of sleeping pills, a few crocodile tears, and they all turned against you completely. They'll give me everything now. Your position, your family, your child, even your wife. And they'll hand it over with smiles on their faces." Daniel stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Matthew opened his eyes then, meeting his brother's gaze with unmasked hatred. "Do you know why? Because I despise you, I always have. You had what I never did, parents who loved you, a childhood without chains, an education, a company to inherit. I lived like a dog while you lived like a prince. I'll take it all, Daniel, every shred of it. Your name will be remembered as nothing but a cruel, bitter shadow while I shine in your place." His laugh was soft, chilling. "Nancy already looks at me differently, doesn't she? And your daughter, she loves me more than you. Soon, they won't even remember you existed. That's how completely I'll erase you." Daniel's chest rose and fell, but his face betrayed nothing. Inside, the last remnants of grief hardened into steel. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was malice, raw and deliberate. And now, revealed in private, Daniel finally saw the truth of his brother's return. He turned without a word, the echo of Matthew's laughter following him down the sterile corridor. To the family outside, he was still the villain, the cold-hearted son who drove his brother to despair. But inside, he carried a new certainty: the game had changed. They had stripped him of everything: position, affection, loyalty, even fatherhood, but in doing so, they had also freed him. And one day, when Matthew overreached as he inevitably would, Daniel would be ready. For now, silence was his weapon. The years had carved lines into Daniel's face, but they had not weakened him. If anything, time had sculpted him into someone colder, sharper, untouchable. His departure from the Wang household had been quiet, but his re-emergence was thunder. Abroad, he had transformed investments into empires, setbacks into stepping stones. He had built a life on his own terms, a life where loyalty was earned, not demanded. Karen had stood beside him through it all, no longer the quiet admirer in the shadows, but the steadfast partner who shared his burdens and joys. Together they had raised a son, David, whose laughter filled the home in ways Daniel had thought lost forever. When he finally returned to the country, it was not for reconciliation, but conquest. His company had secured the acquisition of failing assets, among them, the remnants of the Wang business. What had once been the pride of his family was now on the auction block, and he was the buyer with the highest hand. News of his return spread quickly. His parents, older and frailer now, sought him out, desperation dulling their pride. Freya followed, her once cold eyes softened by fatigue and regret. Nancy appeared as well, her beauty dimmed by years of wear and disillusionment. And Lily, taller now, her face a mixture of shame and longing, came trailing behind her mother like a ghost of the child who had once called him cruel. They found him in the lobby of his hotel, a place of marble floors and gleaming chandeliers that mirrored the man he had become, distant, brilliant, impossible to ignore. Karen stood beside him, her hand lightly resting on his arm, her presence a silent declaration of their unity. His mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Daniel, son, we were wrong." Her eyes brimmed with tears, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "We were blind, so blind. Matthew, he deceived us. He ruined every thing. We should have seen it, should have listened to you. Please, can you forgive us?" Daniel studied her, the woman who once turned her face away when he begged for fairness. Her hair was streaked with grey now, her shoulders hunched, but her excuses had not aged into justification. "Forgive you?" His voice was calm, steady. "Tell me, when you looked into my eyes back then, did you not see the truth, or did you simply refuse to?" His father stepped forward, though his frame was thinner, his once commanding voice now hoarse. "Daniel, we are not asking for excuses, we admit it, we failed you, we gave Matthew everything, and in return, he gave us nothing but shame. The company you built with your own blood collapsed in his hands, we have nothing left, but perhaps, Perhaps you could consider coming back, taking what is rightfully yours. Daniel gave a thin smile. What is rightfully mine? I already have it. Everything you denied me, I built myself. I don't need your inheritance, your approval, or your name. You are asking me to forgive, but all you really want is a savior. I am not that for you anymore. Freya, who had once sneered at him for being selfish, stepped forward next. Her eyes were swollen, her lips trembling. Brother, I was cruel. I shielded Matthew even when I knew he was wrong. I thought I was protecting the family, but I destroyed it instead. I beg you, please don't turn your back on us forever. We still have blood between us. Daniel's gaze was like ice. Blood? He repeated. When Matthew pushed me down the stairs, when you blamed me for his failures, when you spat the word selfish at me, was that blood? You only remember it now because your chosen golden child left you with ashes. The silence was thick, suffocating. That was when Nancy stepped forward, her face pale, her voice trembling with something between pride and desperation. Daniel. I was wrong too, I see it now. Matthew was not the man I thought. He whispered lies, he played on my pity. I thought I was helping him, but I destroyed what we had. Please, can't we go back to the way things were, for Lily's sake? Karen stiffened beside him, but Daniel only raised his hand, stilling her. He looked at Nancy the way one might look at a stranger. Go back? Nancy, you already did go back, to him. You chose him over me, over us. You defended him as your brother-in-law until the words turned to something more. Don't insult me by pretending it was pity. You admired him, you wanted him. And now that he's broken, you crawl back to me? Nancy's lips parted, her breath catching. For once, she had no defense. It was Lily who broke the silence, her voice choked with tears. Dad? She hadn't called him that in years, not since she spat the words that she wanted Matthew instead. Dad, I was wrong, I didn't understand. I thought you were cruel, but it was him, it was Matthew who lied. Please, I don't want anyone else to be my father, I only want you. Give me one more chance, just one, please. Her tears fell freely, splashing onto the marble floor. Her voice cracked, carrying the weight of regret. I'll do anything. I'll never betray you again. Just come back to us, Dad. Daniel's chest tightened for a moment. She was still his daughter by blood, still the child he had once rocked through fevers. But then he remembered the hospital room, her young face twisted in contempt, her small voice saying she wished Matthew were her father. He remembered the doors slammed in his face, the years of silence, the photographs on social media where she smiled beside Matthew while he was erased. His face did not soften. Lee, he said quietly. Do you remember the last chance I gave you? It was 5 years ago. You used it then. There is nothing left to give now. Her sobs filled the hall, but Daniel did not falter. And then came Matthew. Crippled now, a cane supporting his once proud figure, he limped into view. His face was hardened, bitter, but still he carried that smug edge Daniel had always known. So, Matthew sneered, you win. You have your companies, your money, your perfect little family, but don't think that makes you better than me. I lived in filth, I bled in places you couldn't imagine. You had everything handed to you, and I had nothing. I only ever wanted to take back what should have been mine. Daniel's gaze was cold steel. Handed to me? I earned every inch while father made me start from the ground. You, he glanced at the cane, the limp, the ruin of a man, were handed everything on a platter, and still, you destroyed it all. Matthew's face twisted. I hate you, he spat. I'll always hate you. You took everything. Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. No, Matthew, you destroyed everything yourself, and what you hate is not me but the reflection of your own failures. The words struck like a blade. Matthew trembled, his cane slipping, and for the first time, he looked not like a rival, but a broken man. Their parents watched, their faces pale, their daughter weeping, their sister silent, their chosen son crippled, their daughter-in-law hollow. And there stood Daniel, untouchable, unyielding, a man remade in fire. He turned, offering no further words. Karen met his eyes, her hand sliding into his. Together they walked out, their footsteps echoing against the marble. Behind them, voices called out, pleading, weeping, breaking, but Daniel did not stop. Because he knew, their regret had come too late. The last chance had been used years ago, and now there was nothing left for them but the ruins they had built themselves. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual noise of travelers, announcements, and rolling luggage, yet within that chaos, Daniel walked in silence, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. Karen walked beside him, her hand gently guiding their young son David, who looked around wide-eyed at the glass walls and plains beyond. To any onlooker, they seemed an ordinary family departing for a journey. But to Daniel, this was not simply departure, it was the final act of severance, the last moment of an old life closing forever. Behind him lingered ghosts, Nancy with her tear-streaked face, begging for another chance, Lily sobbing, desperate to reclaim the father she had once scorned, Matthew, crippled and bitter, still spitting hatred even as his empire of lies crumbled. His parents, aged and broken, their pride shattered by the very son they had chosen over him. For years, they had been the axis around which his life revolved, the source of his loyalty, his suffering, his downfall. Now, they were nothing more than spectators at the end of a story that no longer belonged to them. Karen glanced at him as they walked, her eyes searching his face. She had seen all of it, the confrontation, the pleas, the collapse. Her voice was quiet. "Are you all right?" Daniel gave the faintest of nods. "I'm free." The words were not spoken for her reassurance, they were for himself, a declaration to the silence inside him. For too long, he had carried chains forged from duty, from the desperate need to be seen, to be loved, to be valued by people who had already chosen to discard him. Betrayal had cut him, yes, but it had also carved away the illusions that bound him. It had forced him to see the truth: he was never meant to be their cherished son, their trusted brother, their beloved husband. He had only been a tool, a foil, a shadow, and shadows do not beg for the sun, they create their own light. The boarding announcement echoed overhead. Karen tightened her grip on his arm. David tugged at his sleeve, his small voice piping, "Dad, can I sit by the window?" Daniel's expression softened. He bent down slightly, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course, the window seat is yours." It was such a small exchange, yet it struck him with quiet force. This child, this boy who called him dad with unquestioning trust, who looked at him with admiration rather than disdain, was proof that he had not lost everything. He had lost what was false, what was poisonous, and in return, life had given him something real. As they handed their passports to the attendant, Daniel caught sight of movement beyond the glass doors. 5 figures lingered at a distance, half hidden by the crowd. He didn't need to look closely to know who they were. His parents, Freya, Nancy, and Lily. They had come, perhaps hoping for one last chance, one last word, one last shred of forgiveness, but Daniel did not turn his head. He did not lift his hand in acknowledgement. To him, they were already gone, buried in the past with the ashes of everything they had destroyed. The family had collapsed into regret, just as he always knew they would. Matthew had been exposed, his treachery against the company, his sale of secrets, his downfall into disability and disgrace. Freya had lost her sharpness, her cold superiority dulled by the burden of ruin. His parents had aged beyond their years, haunted by the knowledge that they had sacrificed their loyal son for the one who betrayed them. And Nancy, once the devoted college girl, later the cold wife, was nothing more than a hollow shell, her beauty faded, her pride broken. They had destroyed themselves. Daniel had not needed to lift a hand. That was the purest form of revenge, he realized, not striking, not scheming, not raging. Simply walking away, succeeding beyond their reach, leaving them to choke on the consequences of their choices. They had chosen Matthew. They had chosen to abandon him. And so he abandoned them completely, without hesitation, without remorse. On the plane, as engines roared to life, Karen leaned her head against his shoulder. "You didn't even look at them," she murmured. "There was no need," Daniel replied. She was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Daniel looked out the window, watching the runway lights blur into streaks of gold. Regret, once it had consumed him, eaten at him until he could barely breathe, but now there was only clarity. "No," he said finally. "Without betrayal, I would never have seen the truth. Without being cast aside, I would never have learned my own worth. And without losing them, I would never have found you, or him." His eyes shifted to David, who was already gazing out the window with a child's unbroken wonder. Karen smiled faintly, her hand finding his. "Then it was all worth it." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. "It was." As the plane lifted from the ground, the city spread out beneath them, streets, buildings, lights, all growing smaller, distant, irrelevant. Daniel let his eyes linger for a moment, then turned away. The past was behind him now, locked away with the ruins of a family that had never truly been his. Ahead lay only open sky, a horizon unclaimed, a life unshackled. He exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry years of weight with it. Karen's warmth pressed against his side, David's laughter rang faintly through the cabin, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt light. The betrayal had given him pain, but it had also given him clarity. The collapse of his old life had been the foundation of his new one. Real love, not conditional, not transactional, but steady and true, had given him strength. He had walked through fire, and on the other side, he had found himself. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the steady hum of the plane soothe him. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but he was ready. Not because he needed to prove himself to anyone, but because at last, he lived only for himself and the people who truly mattered. The past called from the ground below, voices drowned in regret, faces wet with tears. But Daniel did not answer. He did not look back. He looked only forward.